Hi, welcome to this Codegarden session called Getting Started with Unit Testing in Umbraco 8. My name is Dennis Adolfi and I will be your host for this session. I should start off by saying that this session is called Getting Started with Unit Testing. It's not called Mastering the Art of Unit Testing. The target audience, it would be anyone new, completely new to unit testing, or maybe you've done unit testing, maybe not in Umbraco, or you tried it and got stuck. And hopefully by the end of this session you will be motivated to pick up unit testing again. But we're just going to scratch the surface on a lot of topics here, and once you are hooked, you could dig deeper into specific subjects. And please reach out to me anytime on Twitter or any other social media if you want to talk more about unit testing. I love to talk about unit testing and Umbraco. We have a lot to cover and very little time. So the agenda is in two sections. So the first portion of this session, we're going to talk about unit testing in .NET specific. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is unit testing and why do we need it, without focusing too much on Umbraco. And in the second part, we're going to talk more about unit testing specifically in Umbraco. A little bit about how to use the documentation that's available, and how to get started, and then how we can make unit testing even faster for someone new by using a project I've created, which I'm going to talk more about in the end. My name is Dennis Adolfi. I am a developer at Knowit Experience in Gothenburg, Sweden. I've been working with Umbraco since 2013, so that would be 8 years now. I've been involved in more than 50 Umbraco projects, and I'm a certified master since 2017 and a two-time Umbraco MVP. I've been involved in the community basically since the start, by doing public speaking, contributing, teaching, workshops, written a bunch of articles and tutorials, helping out in the forum. And I have a blog where I write about Umbraco and unit testing, which is called adolfi.dev. Please check it out. But now let's jump into today's topic, which is called unit testing. So if you go to Wikipedia and you type in unit testing, you're going to get this very good explanation of unit testing, which is: in computer programming, unit testing is a software testing method by which individual units of source code, sets of one or more computer program modules together with associated control data, usage procedure and operating procedure are tested to determine whether they are fit for use. So this is a terrible way of explaining unit testing. It's basically a super complicated way of explaining something that's not complicated at all. I can understand why someone would be scared of unit testing by just reading this explanation on Wikipedia. So my goal in this session is to explain it in somewhat easier terms. So unit testing essentially is just code that runs your code. Basically, code that runs your implementation code. And you might think that you've never done a unit test before, but have you ever created a console application with a single main method in it, where you do some operation on your implementation code and you get an output that you print in a console write line? Well, that is essentially a unit test. But it's just that these unit testing frameworks we use, like NUnit or XUnit, they make it a little bit more elegant, and you get better grouping of your different tests and a better UI. But essentially, a main method that calls your implementation code and evaluates the output is essentially a unit test. But you should use the testing framework. It's a lot easier than having a bunch of console applications. A unit test always has an expected result. You expect something from your implementation code. Either of you write your expected result first, then you're doing test-driven development, TDD. We're not going to talk about TDD in this session, or you've written your expected result afterwards. But you always have an expected result on a unit test. Then you always get an actual result from a unit test. And then you compare these two, the actual result to the expected result. This could be string comparison, they can be Boolean, they can be integers, they can be whatever. You're just checking to see whether they are the same, basically. So, and it's impossible to talk about unit testing without covering integration testing, which is a unit test should never interact with an API or a database or a file structure or a file system. A unit test that runs and succeeds on my computer should always run and succeed on your computer. There shouldn't be any difference depending on the environment the unit test is running on. An integration test usually interacts with some sort of external system, like I mentioned, an API or a database or a file system. Also, a unit test usually tests a small part of your application, whereas an integration test tests a lot of moving parts working as a whole. So that's basically the difference. But bear in mind that these are just two namings of the same thing. You don't write, there's the same attributes and the same code you write when you write an integration test and a unit test. It's just two different names being used depending on what you're testing. So don't sweat it in the beginning if you don't know if you're writing a unit test or an integration test right now. That doesn't matter. So if you're not doing a unit test, if you're not writing unit tests today, then you're probably doing manual testing. Manual testing is when you're writing code and then you are building your project. You fire up the browser, maybe you log in somewhere, you navigate to a page, and you fill in some values in a form of some sort, and you press submit, and then bam, it fails. It doesn't do what you expect it to. And then maybe you have the debugger attached, and you go back to your code and you tweak it, and then you repeat this cycle again. You go back to the browser, log in, yada yada, go to that page, fill in the values, submit. And you do this all over and over again until it does what you expect it to. Now with unit tests, you don't have to do this because you create unit tests that cover every single scenario and possible scenario from this output. So you create happy cases, of course, but you can also create tests that test expected errors or validation errors on that form. And you don't have to test all of this in the browser because you have unit tests covering it. Then obviously unit testing doesn't replace all your manual testing, because at the end, when you've done your implementation, you actually have to run the browser and actually at least once and check to see that it actually looks the way you want. But that's more, CSS, HTML stuff. But you can reduce the amount of manual testing heavily by writing unit tests. And I would argue that it actually reduces your development time because you have all these unit tests that so you don't have to do all the manual testing. So there's a lot of one argument for not doing unit testing is because I don't have the time, but I would argue that you will save time by doing unit tests, except it's probably in the short term versus long term. But I don't think in the long run, if you also count in the amount of reduced bugs, I think you would actually save time with unit tests. But let's leave it at that. A big part of unit testing, and it's impossible to talk about unit testing without mentioning mocking. Mocking is essentially faking dependencies that's being used in your unit tests. And usually when you're having troubles with unit testing, or you hear someone having troubles with unit testing, it's usually not unit testing per se, it's usually the mocking part that's the hard part, because some dependencies can be tricky to mock, but we're going to see later in the documentation that there's a lot of these tricky dependencies that's been easier now to mock thanks to the documentation. And the last thing I just want to mention is that if you're going to do unit testing and you're new to it, if you don't know dependency injection, you probably need to learn it, because it just makes unit testing so much easier when you're injecting your dependencies into your implementation code rather than instantiating dependencies inside your code. It makes it so much easier. So I would really recommend that you first learn dependency injection before unit testing. And here's a super basic example of how a unit test in .NET looks like. This is not Umbraco related, remember. But basically we have, it's just a method that has an attribute on it. In this case it's called test. The attribute depends on what test framework you're using. This is using NUnit, so it's called a test. And then your class has an attribute called test fixture. Then you name your test. There's a lot of different standards on how to name tests, and that's usually, as long as everyone in your team is doing the same naming, it doesn't really matter how you name them. But I prefer this given when then standard. And then inside your test, you usually arrange tests in 3 portions called arrange, act, and assert. So in the first portion, you arrange the dependencies and instantiate dependencies that you're going to use in the next part. Then in the act part, you're doing some sort of operation on your implementation code, and you get an actual result back. And then in the last section, the assert, you check to see whether the expected result matches the actual result. Bear in mind that you don't have to write these comments I've written, arrange, act, assert. You don't have to have them in every test. These are just examples so that you can see how to structure a test. And anyway, when you run your tests, you're going to get this little view to the left where you get the green or red test in your test runner in Visual Studio. So that's how a unit test looks like. Why do we need unit tests? So first thing is that it gives us the confidence to change code. So imagine you're invited to a project that has a huge code base and thousands and thousands of visitors, and you're asked to do a change in the source code that could potentially affect a lot of moving parts. How confident do you feel when you're doing that change or when you're doing that deploy, that you potentially have broken things that could be all over the place? Now, if you imagine that project had thousands of unit tests, you're going to have thousands of unit tests if everyone in the team writes tests properly. So imagine you have thousands of unit tests, and now you run your tests and they are all green after you've done your implementation. it's going to be a lot better feeling to do that deploy. Sure, you can't be sure that you haven't introduced a bug. You can still introduce bugs even if you have unit testing, but at least you know that all the cases that you're covering before with unit tests are now still working. You haven't broken anything that's already been covered by tests. So if you've introduced a bug now, then that's the problem is more that a lack of tests than what you implemented. So yeah, confidence to change. Also, tests are securing the behavior of your code. I like to picture it when you're doing when you were a kid and you were building tree houses. So the next thing you do after you're finished with your tree house is you create traps, right? Because you didn't want anyone else of the neighborhood kids to ruin your treehouse. So unit tests are probably usually the same because you're securing the behavior of your code with the tests, and if someone else in your team or yourself days, weeks, months, years later does something in your implementation code or other parts that your code interacts with that makes your code not work anymore, the tests will fail and you and everyone else in the team will get notified and can act on it. So I like the little metaphor of the treehouse and the traps with unit tests. Yeah, unit tests, it lets you find bugs in an earlier stage. You find the bugs usually in your test runner rather than in production. And it's also a very good form of living documentation because we know that us developers were not the best at keeping written documentation updated, but unit tests, they're kind of forced to stay updated as the code changes to be able to still pass. So the first thing I do when I'm introduced to a new project is run all the tests and go through the tests to see how is this project working. So now let's get to the Umbraco specific parts. So there's not any special difference with how you write your tests in Umbraco. There's not any special attributes or anything. You still write .NET tests in Umbraco. It's just that when you're using a CMS like Umbraco, there's a lot of things that happens behind the scenes that you are not aware of. And there's a lot of dependencies being thrown around that you don't have to care about. But when you're doing unit testing, you're going to have to be aware about all of these dependencies, and you're also going to learn a lot more about how Umbraco works under the hood once you get started with unit testing. Umbraco uses dependency injection heavily, which is very nice for us who are doing unit testing because it makes it so much easier to write tests. And a little word of advice is that don't test Umbraco. Umbraco has already been tested in the source code. There's a bunch of tests in the source code of Umbraco. So you don't have to write your own tests to verify that the Umbraco helper does what it's supposed to. You're just going to spend too much time writing tests. Instead, write tests to verify that your code interacts how it interacts with Umbraco. Oh, sorry. So, let's look at how a unit test in Umbraco could look like. So, in this example, we have a home controller that inherits a render MVC controller. We're all aware of how this works. And then we have an index method that returns a view model. And in this case, we're also using the Umbraco helper to fetch a dictionary value. And then we have the actual test, which inherits a base class, which we're going to look at later from the documentation. And we're doing a setup before each test, where we instantiate the controller. And then, as I mentioned, the three portions of a test, which is the first portion where I'm creating a model, a common model, where I'm mocking an iPublish content. Then I'm I'm acting on my controller where I'm calling the index method, and I get an actual result back, and then I'm comparing the actual result I got from the expected result. So this is a basic test in Umbraco, and what you're going to notice here is this constructor over here. So if you're not doing unit testing today, then you might not use this constructor at all, or you're just using it with your own services injected. But when you're doing unit testing, you're going to have to explicitly throw in all the dependencies that the render MVC controller needs, which is good because then we can mock them and we can make them behave the way we want to and perform tests on it. And the reason why this works, and the reason why you haven't maybe noticed it before, is that the render MVC controller inherits a class called Umbraco controller. The Umbraco controller has two constructors, one empty constructor and one explicit constructor. So this empty constructor here is the reason why you never have to care about injecting all the dependencies that Umbraco needs. Is because Umbraco will automatically resolve them from the service locator. And this is great, but it's not great if you're doing unit testing. So in unit testing, we want to be able to inject all of these dependencies so that we can fake them and write tests against them. So that's why we also have the explicit constructor, where we inject all of these services. And bear in mind that all of these dependencies have already been registered in the core, so you don't have to register all of these dependencies in the IOC container. That's already been handled, so you can just start injecting them like this, and they will be resolved at runtime. And this is just an example that other components in Umbraco, such as a default URL provider, also has an explicit constructor with all of these dependencies being used. So a lot of these dependencies are interfaces, which is very good because it makes it so much easier to mock. Some of these dependencies are not interfaces, so that's a little more tricky to mock, but thankfully we have the documentation, so we can just copy paste from the documentation the components that we need to mock. Speaking of the documentation, here's a little story time about the Umbraco unit testing documentation. So back in February 2019, Umbraco 8 was released, and while everyone was sharing and clapping, and I was too, but I was starting to try how to write unit tests against Umbraco 8, and I had some troubles with it. So I created a post on Our where I started a discussion on how are you doing unit testing. Here's some examples. I shared some examples, people joined in and shared their examples, and after a while we figured that we probably need some sort of documentation section on Our with samples. So I submitted a pull request to our Umbraco, to the documentation, saying that we need some documentation for unit testing, and basically I was expecting that someone would swoop in and write the documentation for me. But the response I got was that this looks great, would you be up for contributing to this documentation? So I felt a bit embarrassed that I didn't actually think of writing it myself, but I did, and I submitted a pull request, and the first documentation on unit testing was written, so please check it out. There has a bunch of examples on how to test different components in Umbraco and how to do some mocking, and with this documentation, these are the steps you need to get started with unit testing in Umbraco. So you create a Visual Studio solution, you install Umbraco, which is the install package, Umbraco CMS. You create a test project. It's a good to have all your tests in a separate project. Then it's optional if you want to have a core project, of course, or any other project, so you separate things. Then you need to install a test framework. I recommend using NUnit because a lot of the examples in the documentations are written in NUnit, so it makes it easier for you to copy-paste. Same thing with the mocking framework. I recommend starting with mock if you haven't worked with unit testing before. Then you copy the base class and you create something to test and a test class that inherits from the base test class, and you create a method and you run your tests. So this is the way it's been working since 2019, and it's been going pretty well. But earlier this year I was thinking, how can we make unit testing even easier for someone completely new to unit testing? Someone who on his or her lunch break just want to try it out, want to dip their toe in unit testing and just get a green test quickly. So this is still, even though we've done a lot of things to make it easier, this is still 12 steps. So that's the idea. When the idea came that I created this project called Umbraco Unit Testing on GitHub, where basically this is a pre-made solution with two projects, a core project, which is basically the Umbraco project, not the web project. I excluded that because we don't really need it in this case. And then a test project that includes every test from the Umbraco documentation. So using this project, the steps to get started with unit testing now looks like this. It's 3 steps. You clone the project, you open it in Visual Studio, and you run tests. And the first thing you're going to see is this view, where with the 21 tests from the Umbraco documentation, all green, and you can now start to experiment with unit testing. You can see the relationship between the implementation code and the test, and if you change something in the implementation code, your tests will fail, and the other way around. And you can start experimenting and learn more about unit testing using this project. And feel free to contribute and add more tests to it. I'm happy to take pull requests. So I'm seeing I'm running out of time here, so I just want to end with please try this project out. If you like it, add a little star on it. That will make my day. And if you want to read more about unit testing and Umbraco, check out my blog called adolfi.dev, where I write a lot about Umbraco and unit testing in .NET. And thank you.